The Game Boy, notable for such landmark titles as Tetris, Super Mario Land, and Link's Awakening. For some players, however, their nostalgia towards the system is tied not only to its games, but its wild assortment of accessories. The era produced a glut of unexpected peripherals for the device. Everything from a camera to a fish sonar was covered in a frantic bid to cash in on Nintendo's hit handheld. Many of these fetched top dollar in online auctions years later, as enthusiasts continue to hunt down these increasingly obscure pieces of video game history. But for nearly 30 years, one of these has consistently eluded collectors around the world, a device known as WorkBoy. This PDA-style add-on would have granted users access to all manner of productivity-related applications. Propping the Game Boy up with its accompanying stand and plugging it in promised to essentially transform it into a small personal computer. Officially licensed by Nintendo and produced by Washington-based Fabtech Inc., the WorkBoy was previewed by multiple press outlets in the early 90s before vanishing without a trace. In the absence of an explanation from any of the parties involved, a mystery spanning multiple decades lingered. What really happened to the WorkBoy, and would it be possible for me to find one nearly 30 years later? I set out to answer these questions and more. The result was an investigation spanning many months. In this edition of Game History Secrets, I bring you the story of the WorkBoy and my experiences with it.
You can have all the power and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand.
Tracing the origins of the WorkBoy takes us all the way back to the early 1990s. Online, information on its creation has been largely sourced from a small handful of gaming magazines that had written features on it back in the day, such as Nintendo Power. The Game Boy was in its prime, and two companies had joined forces across two continents to take advantage of this rapidly expanding user base. Source Research and Development in the UK designed the peripheral, and Fabtech, a Washington-based startup, was planning to produce it in close collaboration with Nintendo. Trademark filings indicate that the device was first registered by Nintendo of America in January 1992. Several months later, the WorkBoy came to the attention of the press when it made a couple of appearances at trade shows, most notably the Consumer Electronics Show in May. In the midst of a massive Nintendo presence at the event was a modest Fabtech booth where an early prototype could be glimpsed, displaying its various functions. Responses to the demonstration were largely positive. UK publication GameZone described it as an impressive little utility and said, Nintendo's success was visible by its showing at the CES. It virtually had a whole hangar to itself, filled with its own products and those of its developers, but there was little on offer that was radically different. Little, that is, except the WorkBoy. A Chicago Tribune writer, on the other hand, was less enamored with it, branding it as the exhibition's most ridiculous Nintendo peripheral. It's just the thing for the 12-year-old entrepreneur on the go, and it should be a big hit with young drug dealers everywhere, they said. These comments aside, the WorkBoy star was clearly rising. The developers were being profiled in magazines, Nintendo was pushing it at events, and it was even given a glowing endorsement on UK television. Games Master, a popular UK video game TV show, ranked it as their #1 add-on for handheld consoles. What's more is that they had arranged to launch the WorkBoy exclusively at a Games Master live event, due to take place in December 1992. Games Master Live did go forward at Birmingham's NEC, but the WorkBoy was nowhere to be found. The show never revisited the topic, and the device was never again seen. Despite this, among those aware of the niche add-on, it has become commonly believed that it did receive a release, but that very few units were produced. This idea seemingly spread to popular internet series The Angry Video Game Nerd, as seen in his coverage of Game Boy accessories.
Lots of these Game Boy accessories are rare. Some of the ones that I couldn't get my hands on are the Game Boy FM radio, the WorkBoy, where you can plug in a keyboard and turn the Game Boy into a personal computer, just in case you didn't like using a monitor.
The truth is, however, that the WorkBoy was never released, and no prototype units have ever been recovered. To find out why, I began reaching out to former staff from Source R&D, its original creators. As I began my research in late 2019, it became apparent to me that I was not the first person to look into this. I spoke to a number of fellow writers and gaming history enthusiasts who had also attempted to get answers on why the WorkBoy had disappeared. Tracking down the developers of an unreleased peripheral from nearly 3 decades ago has its challenges. The two major companies behind it, Source and Fabtech, ceased operations long ago, and everyone who worked there has obviously moved on with their lives. They've found work in other industries, some of them have retired, and in some cases they've forgotten a lot of what they were privy to. But all was not lost. I did have a couple of leads to go on. A number of Source staff were featured in a 1992 issue of Game Zone magazine. Having both names and faces made tracking them down considerably easier. All these years later, the former members of Source typically maintained a fairly minimal internet presence, but thankfully the person whose insight I most sought was reachable. That was the original architect of the WorkBoy, Ed Gill, who agreed to share his side of the story. Eddie founded Source in 1987. The company, based in Leeds, England, allowed him to realise his ambitions of inventing new technologies. Alongside these technological pursuits, they were also creating video games. This arm of the business led to them sometimes being referred to as Source the Software House. The company developed a number of titles, including Game Boy puzzle game Pyramids of Ra and Noah's Ark, a religious platformer for NES published by Konami. It was only a matter of time before the company's fascinations with technology and video games overlapped, and in early 1992, the WorkBoy was born. Eddie, partnering with Fabtech in the US, had identified a gap in the market for a Game Boy add-on for productivity purposes. With personal computers still being financially prohibitive to many and holding limited appeal to the masses, Eddie's concept for the WorkBoy presented a more accessible alternative. It was a lower cost option that could be used with a device many families already owned. The gadget offered a multitude of different functions, including a world clock, calculator, bank account statements, weight and currency conversions, and an appointment book. It would have retailed at around $79 to $89 US in around late 1992, early 1993. As to why this all never came about, Eddie presented his recollection of events, but suggested I reach out to someone else for clarification. He also left me with one more tantalizing piece of information. Eddie had not seen a WorkBoy in person for many years. Despite creating it, he did not own a prototype himself, and believed that potentially only 2 were left in existence. One, he said, was rumoured to have been retained deep in the vaults of Nintendo, the other was possibly in the possession of a former colleague of his. This individual was Frank Ballou, the founder of Fabtech, who was in charge of production on the WorkBoy. Ballou was a games industry veteran of many years, having worked at numerous big companies at the dawn of the home console market. Years later, he had left the business behind and was imparting his wisdom at speaking gigs around the world. Skyping in from his home in Athens, Greece, Frank regaled me with how he came to be in charge of a lost Game Boy add-on. His time in the industry started in 1975 at Atari, where he became the vice president of marketing at their coin-operated games division. There he helped steer the company's game output through an unprecedented period of growth. Ultimately, however, Frank was fired from the video game giant in 1982. He claims this happened as the company's management was restructured to incentivize Atari exec Don Osborne from leaving to work for a competitor. Frank ended up at Nintendo of America in 1983, placed in charge of sales and marketing at their coin-op division. After 9 months in the job, he was headhunted by arcade game producer Gottlieb, known as Milestar Electronics at the time, to run their pinball and video development. Frank says he departed Nintendo on very good terms, and was even told by Nintendo of America founder Minoru Arakawa that he had an open invitation to return. This was an offer Frank ended up accepting much sooner than anticipated. Less than 1 year later, he quit Milestar following friction with their parent company Columbia Pictures.
After 9 months, I went back to Nintendo. Howard Lincoln, who is senior vice president, goes, "Frank, What do you mean? Our collar and Ron Judy, you're nuts. How do we know you won't do this again? I go, Howard, if somebody offers me a 35-40% raise again, I probably will do it.
After several years at Nintendo, the winds of change were sweeping the industry. As their grip on the home console market tightened, the arcade industry was steadily becoming less of a focus for Nintendo. Shortly after releasing their PlayChoice 10 cabinets in 1986, Frank made the decision to leave and form his own company.
As I told Nintendo, I got, guys, you've got more to offer the industry. And I go, I've got more to offer the industry. They go, Frank, we thought you would say that, but we understand.
In 1987, Frank formed Fabtech, a game publisher and technology company whose name was derived from its own initials.
We had some shit games like everybody else, but we had some classic games. A game called Cabal, which did very, very well for us.
While heading up Fabtech, Frank was also running the American branch of Japanese arcade game manufacturer Irem. It was through that job that in the late 80s, he met Source founder Ed Gill, creator of the WorkBoy.
Eddie was so far ahead of his time. Overall premise for the WorkBoy was parents are going to get tired of buying games for their kids. Let's buy something that the parents and grandparents will think it's useful for them.
As our chat led into his time developing the WorkBoy, Frank casually dropped a bombshell on our conversation.
I'm looking over in my bookcase, one of the original WorkBoys, just sitting there, you know, and it could have been something.
Just to go back a little bit, did you say that you've got something of the WorkBoy there?
Oh yeah. I've got one that, hold on, my earphones won't reach that far.
A few moments of rummaging later, he appeared on my screen, WorkBoy in hand. Oh wow.
Okay. So you can see that then, yes?
I can see that, yeah. Adding to the gravity of this, Frank mentioned that he believed this was the last WorkBoy left. When the project met its end, he held onto it as a keepsake, a fond reminder of what could have been. After our call, Frank gave me a closer look at this near-finalized prototype. It was in good condition, having survived numerous overseas trips and years of sitting on a shelf. We both agreed that it would more than likely still work. However, we had no way to test it, since Frank did not own an original Game Boy himself. I offered to send him one, but he had a simpler idea. A few weeks later, it arrived in my mailbox. Seeing it in person was more than a little surreal. Up until this point, the only images of it online that I could find were taken 28 years ago, and yet here it was, well kept, preserved in a Game Boy Advance carry case alongside a prototype of Source's Pyramids of Ra game. The question was, would it work? I hooked it up to a few different Game Boys, and the results were anticlimactic. Previously, it was my understanding that simply plugging it into the Game Boy's link cable port and turning it on would allow me to access its features. That was how it was presented in Games Master's piece back in the day, and that was also Frank's recollection of how it functioned. But when I plugged it in, basically nothing happened. The Game Boy wasn't visibly affected in any way, regardless of whether or not I had a cartridge inserted. There was one sign of life, however. Plugging it into a powered-on Game Boy caused the WorkBoy to emit a fairly loud beep out of the speaker on its underside. I caught up with Ed Gill, whose comprehensive knowledge of the device allowed us to diagnose the issue. That noise the WorkBoy was making was actually its alarm function being tripped. The WorkBoy had its own clock and speaker, allowing for the Game Boy to serve as an alarm clock. This was possibly a bug that had yet to be smoothed out of this prototype unit. It was at this point that it also became clear why the WorkBoy wasn't working. Prior to our discussion, Frank had emphasized to me that his memory of the device might be less than perfect, and as it turned out, he was right to do so, because this keyboard was only one piece of the puzzle. As Eddie explained, a separate cartridge was required to access its software. In hindsight, this might seem obvious, but this was the first mention of a cartridge being included that I had come across. None of the original literature from the project referenced one, nor did any of the magazine write-ups I had seen. I went back to the drawing board and started reaching out to some other former developers to see if, by some remote chance, someone still had the software we needed. It was then that one of these game industry alumni raised a possibility I had only briefly considered. Starting in April 2020, following a number of high-profile security breaches in the previous 2 years, the contents of some hacked Nintendo servers leaked online. The files, originally linked to on 4chan, encompassed a mammoth hoard of data going back decades. This gigantic dump of illicitly obtained intellectual property was christened as the gigaleak. While gaming historians the world over reveled in the discovery of previously unseen and unused assets from classic Nintendo games, my mind was elsewhere. It occurred to me, what if, by some strange twist of fate, these hackers had inadvertently obtained the WorkBoy software? It was a remote possibility, but not something that I could rely upon. Several weeks after recovering the peripheral, the dust was settling on the most significant Nintendo data leak up until that point. I was waiting to hear back from a potential lead when the final piece of the puzzle slid into place. On the 9th of September 2020, another big leak of Nintendo data spilled out onto the internet, and enthusiasts quickly began rifling through it. I was put in touch with one such individual, a contributor to the cutting room floor, known only as Waluigi. They had excavated a ROM from the latest drop, originating from Source and Fabtech. It was none other than the very WorkBoy software I had been searching for. After 28 years of essentially nothing, the software had leaked within only a few weeks of me obtaining the prototype hardware. This wild coincidence wasn't lost on myself and the members of the Source team I'd been speaking to. For as ethically questionable as these leaks were, one upside was that they were reuniting former developers with their long-lost work. Ed Gill, for instance, later told me that he never imagined having a copy of this software again. In the hours after this data was posted, a small handful of interested parties began tinkering around with the WorkBoy ROM, though initial attempts to emulate the software were met with mixed results. The title screen and a menu displaying several different options were accessible, but the applications themselves crashed upon selection. The only one that worked as intended was the calculator app, where users could move a cursor around the screen and push buttons. It is, as I mentioned earlier, this software is only one piece of the puzzle. It was built to be used by a peripheral. The WorkBoy keyboard is not just an accessory, it is intrinsic to the software on a programming level. Without modifications, raw emulation could only take us so far. It was built to be navigated using the buttons on this keyboard. The Game Boy's inputs had limited functionality. Furthermore, the Game Boy does not have a built-in clock, the WorkBoy keyboard does. Without the add-on, there is no way for the clock app to be able to read the time. There were other complications to weigh up as well. Eddie shared that the game cart they were developing contained a small amount of memory, as did the WorkBoy keyboard itself. With all of this said, the time had finally come to put the device to the test and introduce software to hardware. After close to 3 decades of dormancy, there was no guarantee that this, potentially the last remaining WorkBoy, would still work. I burned the ROM to a rewritable cartridge, inserted both cart and add-on, then powered it on. The WorkBoy's usual beeping came out of the speaker once again, but as I booted up the software, the alarm gave way to silence. A push of the keyboard's return button confirmed that it was functional. In fact, it worked without any issues. The buttons across the top of the keyboard allowed instantaneous access to each application. Switching between them was a swift and easy process. All of the errors present in emulation were gone. The clock did think that it had been awakened in the year 2055, but aside from that, it was working, as were all the other apps. The WorkBoy had lived. In total, the software features 12 individual applications, and most of them have secondary functions within them. The most straightforward of these is the clock, which displays the time in both analog and digital formats. It has an alarm feature as well. There is a basic calculator which you operate by pressing different letters on the QWERTY keyboard since it lacks dedicated number buttons. The keys are labelled above them with their alternate functions in the calculator app. The address book app would have allowed users to record phone numbers and other info in a database, although its functionality in this build is limited. By inputting phone numbers into the WorkBoy, players could use it as a digital phone book and automatically dial numbers by playing the dial tones into a phone. The WorkBoy sports a variety of conversion-related applications too. For one, you can view the difference between Fahrenheit and Celsius temperature scales with its interactive thermometer. Another app offers conversion between metric and imperial systems with a plethora of different options like inches to centimeters, feet to meters, and pounds to kilograms. On top of that, the device even offers currency conversion, although it requires an added degree of input on the part of the user. The user must manually insert the exchange rate between the two different currencies before the WorkBoy can begin crunching the numbers. This is of course because the device has no way of automatically updating the rates itself. On the topic of money, the WorkBoy also has facilities for helping manage savings. Users can manually input their income and expenditure to keep track of their finances. Data inputted can be saved to the WorkBoy's records and reviewed later. The remainder of the WorkBoy's tools relate to world geography and languages. The World Functions app includes what it calls a mini translator. The user can search individual words or peruse a glossary of subjects to choose from, such as greetings, travel, food, weather, medical, and emergency. Each category includes a number of common words and phrases that can be translated between English, German, French, Spanish, and Italian. The rest of the WorkBoy fully supports these same 5 languages as well. Lastly is the world map, which allows users to peruse the different countries of the world. Simply type in the name of a country and the map will be highlighted with its location. As a bonus, a select handful of major world nations even include an abridged 8-bit rendition of their respective national anthems that will play when selected. The WorkBoy contains around a dozen national anthems in total. And there you have it, the WorkBoy is real, it works, and this build, labelled 8.87, is very close to a finished product. Ed Gill believes that this version, recovered from Nintendo's servers, was one of several prototypes sent to them during development. Only a few elements remained unclear, such as the device's targeted ability to connect to personal computers, which would have supposedly allowed it to receive contact information and other data. The question remains then, why was it never put into production? The decision ultimately came down to the head of Fabtech, Frank Ballou. Just months before the launch of the WorkBoy, Frank pulled the plug when he learned that plans were in motion at Nintendo to slash the price of the Game Boy. In light of this, Frank worried that the WorkBoy could not be priced competitively enough to succeed. The WorkBoy itself could have retailed for as much as $89.95 in the US. The original launch price of the Game Boy was $89.99. Post-price cut, the WorkBoy could have potentially been more expensive than the handheld itself in a worst-case scenario. The WorkBoy's planned early launch in late '92 at Games Master Live didn't move forward, and in around 1993 the project was effectively scrapped. According to Ed Gill, had it not been, there were other hurdles laying ahead that the device would have had to contend with. In July of '93, around when it was once intended to be in production, a large explosion ripped through a factory making material for computer chips in Japan. At the time, the Sumitomo Chemical Co. facility in Nihama produced more than half of the world's supply of an epoxy resin called Cresol. This is used to make protective cases for computer chips, in particular DRAM, the form of memory which would have been used in the WorkBoy. As a direct result of this disaster, the price of DRAM soared. Had the device been in production, this would have been just one of the challenges Fabtech would have had to navigate. In spite of this, Frank told me that he does believe the WorkBoy would have been successful, and that he has his regrets about cancelling it.
It was at that time that I made that brilliant decision that I kicked myself in the butt for, that I pulled the plug and we didn't go forward. Because I still think at that price, we could have sold some units on it.
So you regret it?
To a certain extent, yes. I'm looking over it in my bookcase, one of the original WorkBoys, just sitting there, and it could have been something.
A couple of years following the cancellation, Frank's time at Fabtech came to an end, as he transferred ownership of the company to his wife at the time and moved on to pastures new. Ed Gill, on the other hand, continued to toy with the idea of the WorkBoy. His original design helped inspire a new device he patented in 1994 for a personal communicator with a keyboard and touchscreen. Gill later licensed this design to Nokia. It became the basis for the Nokia 9000 series of devices that launched in 1996. A few years later, Eddie became a design consultant at Nintendo, where he helped draw plans for a number of accessories that also never came to be. Among his ideas was a revamped WorkBoy for the Game Boy Advance, which held the tentative name WorkBoy 2. It encompassed many of the same features of its predecessor and was planned to have online functionality of some kind, such as email and web browsing, as well as a word processor. Production on the WorkBoy 2 never moved forward, and no prototype was ever built. All that remains of it are these concepts, showing the keyboard and shell that would have attached to the handheld. Eddie left Nintendo in 2001, marking the end of his decade-long endeavours to bring a productivity add-on to the Game Boy. Many of the WorkBoy's features are today taken for granted in modern devices, but it isn't hard to appreciate the novelty it would have held back in the early 90s. In an era before widespread internet access and smartphones, this was a Swiss Army knife of productivity applications running on something as simple as the original Game Boy. Whether or not it would have found an audience, however, is something we will never know. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe for more videos just like this one. For more content from me, you can support the show at patreon.com/LiamRobertson, just like these kind people did.